Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Mage, Assassins, and Other Misfits by Annette Marie and Rob Jacobson. Narrated by Iggy Toma. Chapter 1. Darius. 20 years ago. There are countless ways to kill a man with a blade, but only one is an instant death. I pulled my dagger from the back of the man's neck. Blood trickled from the wound as he slumped forward onto his desk. No writhing moans or spurting gore. It was clean and silent. I stepped back, my pulse drumming steadily in my ears. I could count the minutes by the beat of my heart, as accurate as my wristwatch. Time was everything tonight, and the only factor left that could sabotage me. I'd accounted for everything else, but time might ruin me. Seconds slipping past, I turned to the locked filing cabinets along the wall of my target's spacious office. My knife scraped against the C1 vertebrae as I slid it into the target's spinal column just below the base of his skull. My arm was locked around his throat, and as he went limp, I lowered him silently to the floor of his hotel bathroom. Blood had smeared on the sleeve of my leather jacket, but it didn't matter. Everything I wore tonight would be burned to ash, along with the car I'd stolen for transportation. My body was covered from head to toe, gloves on my hands, a mask over my face. I would leave no biological evidence. The potion I'd taken would hide my psychic trail, and the light I was bending around myself obscured my presence. I would leave no fingerprints, fibers, or witnesses. Moving silently out of the bathroom, I glanced at the floor-to-ceiling windows of the suite sitting room. In the distance, the illuminated Statue of Liberty guarded the water like a lonely sentry. The night was advancing, my time slipping away. I wasn't finished yet. My third target was asleep in his bed, on his back, with snores rumbling from his open mouth. I covered his mouth with my gloved hand and slit his throat. I folded the thick bundle of papers in half and slid them into the black leather pouch buckled to my right thigh. Closing the filing drawer, I turned. My fourth target was slouched in a wingback chair in front of a fireplace, coals glowing behind the grate and a half-empty glass of brandy on the table. He could have been sleeping if not for the pallor of his wrinkled skin and the stench of released bowels. I ghosted through the opulent penthouse to the front door. A quick glance at my watch warned that I'd spent too long searching his office. I would have to rush now. Urgency flitted through me before I calmed my thoughts. I couldn't be hasty. Hastiness led to mistakes. I bent the light around me and opened the penthouse door. Fatigue washed over my muscles and weariness dulled the sharp edges of my focus. I steeled myself against them. I had no time to rest. A woman slept beside my fifth target. She was half his age, and she definitely wasn't his wife. She hadn't stirred yet, but I needed her to stay asleep. I slipped a tiny vial from my pocket, pulled the cork, and dribbled it over her sleep-parted lips. Her tongue darted out, catching the liquid out of reflex. Most sleeping potions were a telltale shade of yellow, but not this one. Pocketing the vial, I circled the king bed to my target's side. He'd shoved the covers half off in sleep, his naked abdomen fuzzed with frail white hair. He faced the edge of the bed, and the back of his neck wasn't easily accessible to my blade. In the scant seconds during which I considered my options, his eyes opened. I clamped my hand over his forehead, holding him still. The long dagger that had been sheathed at my hip was already in my other hand. Terror had only just dilated his right pupil when the blade plunged through it. His body spasmed, then stilled. I pulled the dagger out. Not a preferred technique. The frontal lobe of the brain could take a surprising amount of damage without it being fatal. You had to strike deep. I stepped back, blood dripping off the dagger. Sloppy. Any moment where I wasn't in control was one moment too many. I needed to finish this before my stamina ran out. One more target. Invisibility made everything almost too easy. Existing outside the awareness of other people held a certain intoxicating power. They couldn't see me, stop me, or beg me for mercy. They simply died, unaware of my blade, my hand, my face, or my intent. Too easy. Becoming invisible, however, the act of it, that was never easy. I drew in deep, rejuvenating breaths as I released my control over the dim light in the hotel room. It was a far less expensive or expansive space than the other 5 locations I'd visited tonight. A single room with a king bed, a TV, and a small dinette table with 2 chairs. My 6th victim was in his bed. Another back sleeper. Another slit throat. The macabre stain across the white pillows and white duvet drew the eye, out of place in the quiet, clean room. Standing at the small table, I flipped the lid of the briefcase open, its broken lock rattling. Stacks of folders formed 2 neat piles, and the steady drum beat of my heart picked up its tempo in anticipation. I opened the first folder. On the topmost page was a faded drawing of a levitating man surrounded by elemental symbols, a sun emblem on his forehead. My lips quirked down as I lifted the page. This wasn't what I'd expected. I checked my watch. It was late. I had no time left. I almost set the paper down and closed the folder. I was taking it all with me, so I had no need to sift through the documents here. But then I saw the page beneath. It was a photo of an artifact. My gaze darted across it, jumping from the concentric circles to the minuscule lines etched into its metal surface. Still holding the first page, I reached for the second. The briefcase jerked out from under my hand. It flew into the air, the lid snapping closed with a thunk that shattered the silence and soared across the room. Its handle smacked into the palm of the woman standing in the short hallway leading from the hotel suite's entrance. She clutched the briefcase, but she wasn't looking at it. She wasn't looking at the dead man in the bed either. She was staring at me. Because I wasn't hidden. I had released my magic to conserve my near-depleted stamina. Every inch of my skin was covered except for the 2 holes in my mask for my eyes. But it didn't matter how I disguised myself. She would know me anywhere. Darius. Aurelia. I didn't speak her name. I didn't utter a sound, even though the hoarse, agonized rasp in her voice cut through me like my own blade. Why was she here? How? But I knew the answer. Time. I had taken too long. At least 2 of my victims had been discovered, and Aurelia had guessed the connection between them. She'd figured out who was being targeted and had rushed to intercept the killer. Judging by the fact that no other agents were gathered in the hall behind her, she had also guessed who the killer was. She knew what I did for a living. She knew my methods. My hand tightened, creasing the paper I held. Then I bent the light around me and vanished. Darius! This time she howled my name. It was neither a shout nor a scream, but a soul-wrenching symphony of anguish, betrayal, fury, and despair. She flung out her hand, and the coffee maker on the built-in sideboard hurtled through the air toward the spot where I'd vanished. But I'd already moved. Why? She raged. Why did you do this? A chair lifted from the floor and whipped across the room. I ducked, barely evading it, my muscles trembling as the renewed use of my power drained the last of my strength. The Supreme Judiciary Council, she choked. Why are you killing them? Why? Grabbing the briefcase, I tore it from her grasp and hit it with my magic as I sped past her. An invisible force yanked me backward. I wasn't ready for it. What telekinetic could move an invisible target? Only one as skilled as Aurelia, of course. I slammed down on my back. My power wavered, revealing me, and she pounced. Her weight shoved the air out of my lungs, and her telekinetic force pinned my arms. Her face was twisted, her eyes glistening, but no tears marking her cheeks. Her long blonde hair was falling out of its messy ponytail. Her blouse was wrinkled, and no makeup smoothed her skin. Was it for money? Her hoarse question might as well have gutted me. Hidden by my mask, my face contorted. You, she gasped, fighting hard for composure. You always talk about responsibility. You always talk about unchecked power and how destructive it is. And you let someone buy you? No. Or do you just love the hunt too much? Her jaw quivered and her chest heaved. How could you choose killing over me?" "I hadn't." "Answer me!" She grabbed the front of my leather jacket and dug her knuckles into my sternum. "You convinced me you weren't like them." I wasn't. Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I believed you." I gritted my teeth behind my mask, holding back the words I wanted to say, the words I could never say. She reached for my mask to pull it off and reveal my face, but she'd lost her focus. Her power was no longer pinning my arms. I grabbed her wrists and threw her off me. As I rolled onto my feet, my gaze caught on the briefcase, but she was already jumping up. She was fresh and furious, and I was exhausted. I couldn't chance it. Bending the light around me, I fled. She screamed my name as I went, my betrayal chasing me out into the night, where the false dawn tinged the eastern horizon with a faint blue glow. Only when I reached my stolen car, my breaths harsh and muscles burning with weakness, did I realize I still clutched the single page from the briefcase in my hand. I smoothed the creases, glanced at its indecipherable drawing, then climbed into the car. My work wasn't done yet. I needed to destroy the evidence. Aurelia knew, and the mythic world would suspect, but no one could ever prove that the Mage assassin had killed this night. Chapter 2. There's a Denzel Washington movie called Man on Fire. I was that man, not because I was Dakota Fanning's hypervigilant bodyguard, but because I'd made the indefensibly idiotic decision to visit Florence, Arizona, in August. The thermometer currently read somewhere between heart of an active volcano and the actual goddamn sun. It was so hot that my sweat evaporated the instant it left my pores. Thankfully, I was hunkered down in the shade at a cafe, which meant the temperature was closer to surface of a fired-up barbecue. I could handle that for now. Sitting across from me at our small table was Miriam Baker, an affable woman in her 60s with sun-bleached hair and a perfect tan. These days she worked part-time managing the mini-golf and arcade establishment adjoining the cafe, but before that she'd been a middle school teacher. And she was the reason I'd flown over 1,000 miles to bake in the unrelenting desert heat. "It's so strange to hear you call him that," she said with a shake of her head. I shrugged. "It's his name." "We always used to call him Benjamin, or even Benny." "Benny Cade," I snorted. "It makes him sound like a late-night talk show host from the 70s. Miriam's amusement only lasted a second before her mouth flattened. "What kind of investigator are you, Mr. Morris? I don't understand why anyone would come all the way down here from Canada just to talk to me about a former student from 30 years ago." On the surface, that was a perfectly reasonable question. She didn't know that her former student had grown up to be a terrifying, bloodthirsty assassin for a corrupt shadow organization with its influence running deep in the globe's secret magic community. And I wasn't going to fill her in on that little tidbit. "I'm a private investigator," I fibbed. She pursed her lips, unconvinced. "I tried looking you up online. I couldn't find anything." Emphasis on private. "Benjamin is involved in your investigation?" He was the investigation. After Cade had murdered Soze and disappeared on a black helicopter, he'd become our precinct's enemy numero uno. Captain Blythe, once she'd recovered from his attempt on her life, had given me carte blanche to hunt the bastard down. My investigation hadn't exactly been fruitful. MPD records on Cade were limited, and his personal history outside our agency was even harder to uncover. All I'd managed to discover was that he'd grown up in the Florence area and attended a mundane middle school called West Hills where Miriam had worked. "I can't divulge details, Ms. Baker." I tapped my pen lightly on the pad of paper in front of me. "But I would like to ask you a few questions about him." Her eyes narrowed. "He did something, didn't he? Something bad?" "What makes you say that?" She glanced over her shoulder as though the coterie of white-haired snowbirds populating the cafe were all potential spies. To be fair, I shared her paranoia. To keep any eavesdropping geriatrics from sitting at the spot next to us, I'd given it a warped makeover, a smear of jelly donut innards across the table with a few additional droplets on one of the chairs. It was a simple warp, one I would have taken for granted in my younger days. But ever since experiencing the magical vacuum in my mind after reality warping had zapped all my psychic powers, I was perpetually thankful for the magic I had.
"Are you recording this?"
Miriam asked in a hushed tone. I quirked an eyebrow. Should I be?
"I'd rather you didn't. In fact, I'd rather this be off the record altogether."
That's fine. Leaning forward slightly, I lowered my voice. You seem worried. Tension suffused her shoulders.
"Talking about him makes me uncomfortable."
Why's that?
"Benjamin was always a troublemaker."
She waved her hand as though swiping away her statement.
"No, not a troublemaker. I've dealt with plenty of kids who made trouble, perpetually late, disruptive, didn't do their homework. But Benjamin, he was different."
I waited as she searched for the right words, using the quiet moment to jot a few notes on my pad.
"He was cruel," she finally said. "Kids can be mean-spirited. Every teacher knows a bully when they see one. But a bully's behavior is easy to understand once you boil it down. They take the pain they feel and use it as a weapon against others."
She paused as a server showed up with a coffee for each of us. My guess was that the staff poured it cold and let it boil in the sun as they walked it over to our table. Why had I ordered a hot drink on a day scalding enough to cook prime rib to medium well on the sidewalk? A cup of liquid nitrogen would have been a better choice. I thanked the server before turning back to Miriam. So, would you call Cade a bully?
"No."
She poured cream into her coffee.
"He didn't torture other kids to deal with his pain. He did it because he reveled in it."
Torture is a strong word, I observed. She met my eyes over the rim of her coffee mug.
"It's an accurate word for Benjamin."
I thought back to the sickening glee on Cade's face as he'd explained to Leanna and me all the ways in which he would slowly, painfully kill us. It seemed that wasn't a trait he'd developed as an adult. Can you give me an example of him torturing other students? I asked. She huffed a sigh.
"That's the problem. I never caught him in the act. He was slippery."
Slippery, I echoed. How so?
"When he was in 7th grade, our class had a pet turtle named Donatello."
I couldn't help but smirk. Classic.
"The kids really loved him. They all took turns feeding him, cleaning the aquarium, that sort of thing. One day after lunch, one of the students went to check on Donatello."
I grimaced, already having a pretty good idea where this anecdote was headed.
"The poor kid. He screamed and screamed," she continued. "It took me a minute to calm him down, and by that time a bunch of students had gathered around the aquarium. Let's just say Donatello did not go out pleasantly. It was gruesome. The kids were absolutely distraught."
What about Cade?
"I remember his face."
She let out a slow breath.
"He wasn't looking at the turtle's remains. He was watching the other kids, enjoying their reactions."
She paused to gather herself.
"I pulled Benjamin aside and asked him why he'd hurt Donatello. He looked me straight in the eyes and told me no one saw what happened. Anyone could have killed the turtle."
Could it have been someone else? I asked. Another student or a staff member?
"Not a chance," she answered quickly. "I know it was him. I tried getting the principal involved, but he said there was no proof."
Had the principal been protecting murderous little Benny? Or just super committed to upholding due process in his elementary school?
"I could tell you a dozen more stories about Benjamin," Miriam said. "He was the most frightening student I have ever taught. Manipulative, arrogant, remorseless, aggressive. He was a compulsive liar. A few of the boys in the class looked up to him, but most students were terrified of him." A manipulative, arrogant, violent liar who lacked empathy and delighted in murdering small animals? According to my armchair psychological assessment, that ticked off all the boxes on the psychopath checklist. It was chilling to realize Cade had always been this way. Evil was in his DNA. Was he ever punished? I asked. Any suspensions or anything like that? I know he transferred out of your school during 7th grade. Was he expelled? Not that I know of. He had his fair share of detentions, but like I said, he was slippery. She leaned back in her chair and sipped her coffee. In the middle of the 2nd semester, I was doing parent-teacher interviews, and for the first time, Benjamin's father attended. I perked up. Nowhere in all my searching had I found a single reference to Cade's parents. As far as MPD records were concerned, the bald-headed shit-stain was decanted from a cosmic vessel of unfiltered malevolence. What happened? I asked, somewhat too eagerly. I'd met his mother before. She tapped her fingers against her mug. I can't remember her name now. She was a timid woman. Whenever I'd bring up Benjamin's behavioral problems, she'd promise to talk to him, but nothing ever changed. His father, on the other hand. Do you remember his name? Peter, Miriam answered. I don't think they were married, or if they were, he wasn't around very much. He was a severe man, the kind of person I always imagined, always worried Benjamin would grow up to be. I jotted the name down on my pad of paper. I would most definitely be doing a deep dive on Peter Cade as soon as I got back to Vancouver. I told him about Benjamin's issues, even what happened to Donatello. But he was very dismissive. He had a boys will be boys attitude about the whole thing. I scrunched up my nose. Gross. But his demeanor completely changed when I brought up Benjamin's slipperiness. Changed how? I asked, drawing a circle around the word slippery, which I'd written on my pad the first time she'd used it. He got very serious, Miriam said. I told him that his son had a 6th sense that helped him get away with all sorts of bad behavior. He seemed to always know when other people were around or not. It was unsettling, to be frank. That lined up with my experience battling Cade. Even when I was invisi-warping or Darius was hiding himself with his Lumina magic, Cade had known where we were. It hinted at a psychic ability. But according to all the official MPD files, Cade was a standard sorcerer and nothing more. I tapped my pen against my notepad. Is there anything else you remember? Another example of his slipperiness? She squinted and thought, then nodded slowly. During the lunch break one afternoon, I was tidying my classroom on the 2nd floor, and I happened to glance out the window. I saw Benjamin near the bike racks. He was crouching beside a pink bicycle. It wasn't his. He took the bus to school. All of a sudden, he straightened and walked away. It was very abrupt the way he jumped up. A few seconds later, a teacher rounded the corner. Nothing came of it that day, but the day after, someone punctured all the bike's tires. No one saw who did it. A real mystery, I remarked dryly. I had no doubt it was Benjamin's work. What stood out to me was the way Benjamin abandoned his first attempt. He couldn't have seen that teacher coming, and she was far enough away that I don't think he could have heard her either. But he still seemed to know she was about to come around the corner. Weird, I mumbled. When you were talking to Cade's father, what did he say after you mentioned Cade's 6th sense? He told me he could tell I was scared, but that I didn't have to worry. Benjamin would no longer be attending our school. She paused, frowning at her half-empty coffee mug. I think he meant to sound reassuring, but it came across more like a threat. I arched an eyebrow. Assuming the apple didn't fall far from the tree, I suspected Peter Cade had indeed been making a threat. Did you ever see Cade again after that? No. Miriam looked up, unease deepening the wrinkles around her eyes. And to be honest with you, Mr. Morris, I hope I never do. Less than an hour later, I stepped into the deliciously cool atmosphere of my hotel's air-conditioned lobby. It was like receiving a long-awaited hug from a benevolent frost giant. Bad for the environment, good for the Canadian boy who'd lost a significant fraction of his body weight to sweat on the walk back from the cafe. I had my head down, eyes on my phone, swiping back and forth between my contact list and a page showing flights to LA from Phoenix, which had the nearest airport to Florence. It had been 5 months since Leanna had flown home to help her family while her dad underwent cancer treatments. Since I was already this far south and I'd accrued a hefty number of vacation days, maybe I could extend my American workcation and pay her a visit. My finger hovered over her name. One little tap and I could call her, propose my travel plans, and book a flight. But I groaned internally. I wanted to call her. I just didn't know if she wanted me to call her. Before leaving, Leanna had asked me about Jillian, promised to tell me about her own childhood, fallen asleep cuddling with me on the sofa, then taken off to the airport without saying goodbye. Since then, our communication had been normal but kind of distant. Undoubtedly, some of that distance was due to Leanna's stress levels while living at home with her family, dealing with Papa Shen's illness and trying not to ask questions about my investigations that I couldn't answer via phone call or text message. But I also wondered how much of the distance was because of the awkwardly unacknowledged cuddle session followed by her painfully abrupt departure. But that's all it was, right? Once the miles between us were reduced to 0 and I was face to face with her again, things would go back to normal. Or some semblance of it, at least. I stared down at my phone, practically tearing myself in half with indecision, then glanced up to make sure my weird, hesitant hovering wasn't inconveniencing any hotel-goer sharing the lobby with me. And that's when I saw a well-dressed man with salt and pepper hair reading a newspaper in one of the cushy chairs across from the welcome desk. My reunion with Leanna would have to wait. Pocketing my phone, I crossed the lobby and dropped into the chair opposite him. "Fancy seeing you here, Darius." His gray eyes analyzed me from over the top of the newspaper. "How was your interview?" "Interesting. How long have you been in Florence?" "I landed in Phoenix this morning and came straight here." "What brings you to the land of sand and cacti?" As I asked the question, I took in his standard vest and dress shirt getup. "And why in the name of Seth are you wearing long sleeves in the desert? It's like a bazillion degrees out." "Linen is a very breathable fabric," he informed me with a hint of amusement. Folding up the newspaper, he set it on the glossy end table. "We have a meeting." Of course we did. There was less than a 0% chance that Darius had flown all the way to Phoenix and then driven to Florence for an impromptu social call. "Which of your old friends is it this time?" I asked. "Tino. He's the last one." Over the past 5 months, Darius and I had met up with, or in some cases unexpectedly dropped in on, 4 of his former acquaintances and allies from ye olden times, aka when I was still in diapers. Or, more relevantly, when Darius had been an MPD-contracted assassin undertaking assignments that were not only above my pay grade, but also Blythe's too. Or, in straightforward numbers, about 20 years ago. Each of these former accomplices held a piece of the very dangerous puzzle we needed to complete. It was like one of those video games where, in order to acquire an enchanted sword, you needed to beat a handful of mini-bosses. Except instead of battling 3-headed dragons and undead goblins, we were tracking down mythics who didn't want to be tracked down and asking them to hand over valuable and potentially deadly information. "Tino is an archivist from El Paso," Darius continued. "He's rather skittish, so we'll need to keep things light and easy. Deception, surprises, or power plays will send him running." "We're going to Texas?" I asked with a frown, already sorting through possible excuses to give my captain for yet another impromptu change in my travel plans, and wondering if we could hit up a brisket joint along the way. "He's coming to us," Darius clarified. "A direct train from El Paso to Maricopa. He'll be arriving in," he glanced at his watch, "just over an hour.
So ixnay on the isket, bray. A train.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?